This is, for those of you who don't know, is the Jobs in the Developed World panel, and it's not a very exciting title, but it's a rather important subject, I would say. My name's Peter Passell. I'm at the Milken Institute, and I run the Milken Institute Review, which is the magazine which you may occasionally catch glimpses of around here. My first job is to introduce the panelists. Before I do, I would like to point something out interesting. 3 of the 6 of us, I will not identify us, 3 of the 6 of us went to Swarthmore College. And I just noticed that I can guarantee you this, the three of us who went to Swarthmore College are the least well paid. Tells you something, doesn't it? I guess the moral is to go to Stanford. Anyway, at my far right, though hardly in any other way far right, is Dean Baker, who is the co-director of the Center for Economic Policy Research in Washington. Next to him is Beth Ann Bovino, who is the U.S. Chief Strategist at Standard & Poor's.
An economist.
U.S. Chief Economist?
Yeah, did you Google that too? No, I'm the U.S. Chief Economist.
U.S. Chief Economist. Yeah, okay. Yes, I Googled that too. U.S. Chief Economist at Standard & Poor's. I would also point out, which doesn't say anywhere else, that she came out on top of all 88 forecasters rated by the Wall Street Journal for 2013 in terms of the macro statistics. And the U.S. Federal Reserve Board was 7th on that same list. So less is more sometimes. Then to my immediate right is Deanna Farrell. I really apologize. She's the global head of the McKinsey Center for Government, and she's also the former deputy director of the National Economic Council in the Obama administration. To my immediate left is Kevin Hassett, who's the director of economic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. And to my far left is Stephen Ratner, whom probably many of you have heard of. He's the chairman of Willett Advisors, which manages the personal and philanthropic assets of Michael Bloomberg. He's probably better known, though, as the car czar. He managed the structural workouts for Chrysler and General Motors for the Obama administration. And though some of you in this room may disagree, perhaps some of us on this panel may disagree, it was a mighty success. Okay, before I actually begin asking questions here, let me give you a very, very brief description of where we're going with this. And for this, we're going to need some slides.
Could you hand these to the other guys?
Oh, yes.
So don't have to
Please.
Oh, we don't have to crane our necks then.
Indeed. I think most of you know that the European Union has long suffered from high chronic unemployment, in particular youth unemployment, and that's made worse by the Eurozone's snail-like pace of recovery from the recession. If we could see slide 1 there. Are we looking at slide 1?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Equally ominously, the portion of the unemployed who've been unemployed for a very long period is rising. Now, the United States, of course, you also know about the United States these days, but you may not remember that in the year 2000, The Economist magazine dubbed the United States the great American jobs machine. Well, the machine seems to have lost its mojo. In spite of the fact that the recession has now been over for 4 years, time does fly. Unemployment remains extraordinarily high for this point of a recovery. Let's look at slide 5 for that. And again, chronic unemployment is especially worrying. With that baseline, there are 1,000 questions that follow from those basic facts. But let me start with one that typically gets raised first, which is why. Unemployment has certainly fallen less than one would expect from the historical evidence of previous recessions. Is this evidence of our timidity in using fiscal stimulus to get out of the recession? Did we quit too soon, which I think is one point of view? Or are we simply staring at a new reality of what might be called skills mismatch, that once these people were fired, they aren't being rehired because employers are looking twice at what they can and can't do for them. Let's start with Dean Baker on this subject.
Okay, well, to my view, I find a simple story here. I think when we look at the skills mismatch, the structural unemployment story, we have one that really doesn't fit the facts very well. And when we look at the aggregate demand story, we have one that sort of like, what else could you possibly expect? In terms of not fitting the facts, we have one of the slides later talks to the beverage curve, the high vacancy rates. People have pointed out that the vacancy rates had been unusually high for the levels of unemployment we saw about 2 years ago. Well, the unemployment rate's fallen about 1.5 percentage points in that time. No change in the vacancy rate, suggesting that that's not the story here.
By the way, if you tell us what number that slide is, we can put it up
10,
right
that's
now.
number 10.
Number 10, yeah. So that, if we look at, that was something that people had often held up. Other parts of structural unemployment, people, again, the story skills mismatch is supposed to be there are jobs out there, but the unemployed don't have the right skills. Well, some of the other things we should be seeing there is that we should be able to identify clear areas where employers are getting people to work longer hours. They can't find the workers they need, have them work longer hours. We don't really see that, at least not in any large segment of the labor force. The other thing we should be seeing is rising wages. And we don't see that in any significant segment of the labor force. Maybe one of my co-panelists will want to point to North Dakota. I always give people that, 300,000 people there, increase their employment by, 25%. We haven't put a dent in anything. I don't think we have a structural case. On the other hand, aggregate demand, it's kind of hitting us in the head. My story in this, we had a huge housing bubble. It was driving the economy, creating somewhere in the order of $1 trillion in annual demand due to the very high levels of residential construction, and also consumption driven by $8 trillion in housing equity. That disappears. Construction's still depressed primarily because we still have very high vacancy rates, extraordinarily high vacancy rates, although down from the peak. And then on top of that, the consumption that was driven by that equity, that hasn't come back because the equity hasn't come back. Fairly straightforward story. How are we going to replace that demand? Well, we could do it by spending lots of money, but in Washington, that's not popular. What that means is we don't have a way to replace the demand. I mean, we could get the trade deficit down, but again, we haven't taken steps to do that. So we don't have any way to replace the demand. And just to point as a counterexample where this has been done, you might, some of you I'm sure are familiar with the Abe government's policies in Japan. He was put in place as prime minister at the end of 2012. Very aggressive fiscal and monetary stimulus. And their employment to population ratio has risen by 1.6 percentage points over the last year. That'd be the equivalent of 4 million jobs. You would hear about that in the United States. So to my mind, it's a fairly simple, straightforward story. We're trying to explain a mystery that isn't there.
Too little, too late. Who would like to
I'd
take this
counter
side?
that, please.
Okay.
So obviously we had a recession of enormous proportions, and it would be expected that it would take a long time, and we have not seen the growth that would allow that absorption to go as fast as we can. So I think there's a lot of what you're saying that's right, Dean, but I think the story is actually more complicated than you suggest. And I point to 3 things that I think should give us rise to think a little bit more nuanced about the story than just aggregate demand. The first one is, if you go back for the last 5 recessions, now this was a thing of its own, we have a pattern that is, you have a recession, you have significant job loss, and then it takes a number of months to go up to the level of jobs that you had at the beginning of the recession. With each recession, that period of time has taken longer and longer. This last recession was deeper by a factor of 3, and we're still 4 years out, 5 years out, we're still not at pre-employment capacity, despite the fact that GDP has caught up and is surpassed the 2007. And so that's the first thing I'd put on the table. The second thing I'd put on the table is, if you look at the percentage of long-term unemployed in the unemployment picture, since 1950, go back to 1950, the percentage of long-term unemployed hovered between 5 and 20%. Really bad recessions, it'd get up to 20+%. In this last recession, it shot up all the way to 45%. 45% of the unemployed at the peak 2010 were long-term unemployed. And even today, it's still at 36%. So, and the number, I think, is underestimated, because many of those people, after they've been unemployed for a while, just leave the workforce. We have, as you showed in your charts, labor force participation at very low rates historically. There is I don't want to say structural in the sense that there's nothing that can be done about it, and I think that's where people tend to go with this. But this picture of long-term unemployment that is really different, we just haven't seen this since the war, I think should cause us to think a little bit differently about things. And then I think the third thing is when you survey corporates and you survey a lot of people who are looking for employment of all employees of all sorts, they really are not finding the talent that they need over and over again. And so I do think that there is a level of skills mismatch that needs to be addressed with interventions that have to do with linking skills, education, and training on-the-job types of opportunities that will facilitate the situation. I think it really is a little more complicated than if we just get demand up. Maybe if we had 6% growth, we could address the issue, but I think it's unlikely that at our level of wealth, we're going to see 6%, and demographics, we're going to see 6%.
I think both of you guys want to. Then you first, Steve.
Okay. So let me agree and disagree with some of what both the previous speakers have said. Look, there's no question in my mind there is some supply side element to this problem. There is clearly a problem of long-term unemployed who aren't coming back into the workforce. There's clearly some element of a problem of skills in terms of mismatch of skills, and we can all find lots of anecdotal experience or examples of where companies have tried to find certain kinds of workers, can't find them, and all that. But fundamentally, I think this is a demand-side problem. And so I agree with virtually everything, much to my surprise slightly, Dean, I agree with virtually everything that you said about that, and I would just add a couple of points around the edges.
Wall Street and Main Street here. Good.
Wall Street, Main Street. So the first is, I think, to sort of understand why we still have so much unemployment, it's helpful to look at where the jobs have been coming back and where they haven't coming back. So maybe we could show slide 15 for a second. And what you'll see on slide 15, when it emerges, is that we have had very strong growth in education and health. We've actually had reasonably strong growth in professions and business. The black line is total, which gets the total number of jobs back roughly where it starts. The reason, obviously, unemployment is higher because of new entrants in the labor force. And then you see the drag of government, which not just at the federal level, but even more so state and local, have trimmed workforce and obviously not added. And then you see manufacturing at the bottom. And the fact is that, and we can talk if we want about the so-called manufacturing renaissance, but the fact is that manufacturing growth has been slower in this recovery than overall job growth. And so we've added 590,000 manufacturing jobs. It's not nearly enough, as you can see here, to make up for what was lost early in the recession. So I think there is just simply a lack of these jobs and a lack of demand. So why is there a lack of demand? And this is the one thing I'd want to add to what Dean said in terms of his other reasons. Well, part of it is the government. You saw the decline in government jobs. That's a reflection of a lack of demand on part of government. But part of it, and here's, I think, really, honestly, in my view, kind of the key piece of it, is wages. And so if we go to slide 17, and you look at what's happened to wages in this country, they have essentially done nothing. This is on an inflation-adjusted basis from June of 2009 until March. In the last few months, they have ticked up a little bit, and we can talk about what that may mean, and it's actually obviously a good thing in most respects. But for the most part, we've had a wageless, we've not only had a jobless recovery or an insufficiently job-filled recovery, we've had a wageless recovery. And if people don't have money to spend, then you don't have demand. If they can't go out and buy stuff, then the companies that make stuff aren't going to make as much stuff, whether it's hamburgers or whether it's houses or whether it's pretty much anything. So in addition to the wealth effect that Dean talked about, I would add an income effect and the inability of people to go out and spend money. And the last thing I just want to point out on this chart, in case we want to talk about it later, is the spread in what's happened in wage rates. You know, that sort of saying it's roughly equal, roughly down a little bit, masks a lot of things that are going on inside those numbers, and particularly the enormous compression that is going on in manufacturing and the so-called tradable sectors, in the industrial sectors and things that where we are susceptible to global competition. The pressure on wages, including especially in the auto industry where I worked, as you can see at the bottom of that chart, the pressure has been ferocious. And if people are getting lower wages, then it's obviously even harder for them to contribute to demand in the economy.
By the way, I want to put a bookmark in some of that material that Steve alluded to later, because before we're done, I'd like to talk a bit about automation. But I think that Kevin has something to say directly, more directly to this subject.
Well, first remember that if you've got a problem of unemployment being too high, then as a matter of introductory economics, then that means wages need to go down to clear the market, right? And so that's a force that it's normal that you would see in a difficult recession. That in fact, nominal wage rigidity is one of the reasons why unemployment can last a long time in economic models. And so I think that though that I'd like to challenge Dean a little bit, but using some of the stuff that I've done with Dean. And it goes back to the Reinhart Rogoff, what happens after a financial crisis data. If you look, then pretty much the answer is you have about a decade where you're growing a lot slower than you're used to. In the unemployment data that they have for a country in a historic financial crisis that goes through one, then typically a decade after the crisis, the unemployment rate is about double its low before the crisis began. Which means that if we were actually a typical financial crisis country, right now we'd still be in the eights, probably, and we're not. And so I think that it's kind of one of the things that I've not seen the Obama administration do much, but I think that if you drew comparisons to previous countries recovering from financial crises, that there are going to be a lot of metrics by which the U.S. is doing better than expected. And a lot of things where we're right about on the curve, like debt to GDP went almost exactly where it goes for these things. But the challenge for Dean is that, and this is, I think, the challenge for all of us, because I think it's a problem that Dean and I have been writing about, trying to get people to care more about, is that the long-term unemployment problem, the reason why the unemployment rate 10 years later is double the previous low in a typical country, is that you create a class of folks who are really, really hard to employ. They're almost unemployable, but they shouldn't be. But it happens. And there was one recent study where they made up fictional resumes and sent them around to employers and then just varied how long the people were unemployed. And if they were unemployed for a lengthy period, more than 6 months or so, then they couldn't get a call back at all. Like no one wanted to interview them. And that's a reality that's facing millions of Americans right now. And maybe some of them are trying and they're still in the labor force, so you see them in the data. A lot of them are out, which is why the employment to population ratio is so low. And I think that going forward, if we're going to go to an economy that's growing 3-something% rather than 2-something%, then one of the challenges is going to be re-engaging with those people, trying to reconnect them to the labor force. And for me, I don't think that, we could talk about, I think Dean and Larry Summers have become kind of 100% demand guys. I'm an Econ 101 guy. I think there's supply, there's demand. And I think that we could argue about, well, how do we get supply and demand to shift to a point where we're getting more growth? But I think that even if we do that there's going to be a long-term unemployment problem that's going to require very, very specific programs to help them reconnect. For example, one of the things I've received a lot of criticism on the right for is the assertion that we should really consider direct jobs programs. For people who've been unemployed for more than a couple of years, then maybe we need to give them a job for a year to try to reconnect them. But that's the kind of radical thinking we need. And I don't think that having another stimulus or anything like that is going to reconnect the people that have now been out for more than a year or so.
By the way, immediately after we finish this, I want to get to the issue of what the hell do you do about it. But I think
I was going to respond just quickly and then give it to Dean, because it looks like that question was directed right at you, but I figure I'm just going to jump in and just say one more thing. Well, first of all, do you feel like this is about you guys in the audience, do you feel like you're in like a coach in an airplane? That's how I felt when I was sitting out there. Everybody's just, and nobody comes around and offers drinks. But to the question that Kevin was just talking about, yes, of course, in a very, very weak, in a recession, in a very weak recovery, you do expect to see that the businesses aren't hiring as much, and the people they do have, they don't need to raise wages as much. So you do expect to see some squeeze in that. But the most recent report that came out said that businesses, it goes a little bit further than that, because I think it was the New Law report that came out. I don't remember the name of the report, but it talked about in this recovery, what we've seen is jobs are coming back slowly, of course, but where the jobs are on the low-paying workforce, meaning fast foods were doing incredibly well. Healthcare, you'd think healthcare, of course, has been doing well both through this recession and in this recovery, because everybody was sick of hearing all this bad news, so they went to the doctor. But even there, you're seeing very low wage pay, and that's because of specifically what you're looking at in terms of what's hired. It's going to be people who are at retirement homes or assisted living homes. So you're not seeing the
comeback in jobs in the middle class and even in basically higher income wages or middle income wages. So I think that it's a little bit more of a shift. It's not necessarily saying businesses aren't giving the people that are doing the same job the same price. It's that you're not really seeing those jobs anymore, and you're seeing it more on the low income level.
Okay, Dean, last word on this, and then I want to get to the issue, what the hell do we do about it?
Okay, well, to try and be as quick as possible, responding to Kevin's point, I feel funny with Reinhard Rogoff. I had the same sort of argument with people who were after Thomas Piketty's book, because both of them go back over 500 years. Actually, some stuff in Piketty's book goes back 2,000 years, and people go, how do you respond to 2,000 years of evidence? And I guess what I just say is I'm not clear how relevant that is, and to take an analogy perhaps a little crude, if we look back over the last 2,000 years, most kids didn't survive till age of 5. So if someone were to say, oh, we have I'd go, look, we have a problem, infant mortality. I'd go, well, go back 2,000 years. Most kids don't survive to the age of 5. Why would you expect, well, things have changed. We know more. We know modern medicine. We know about, how to prevent epidemics. I think we know more about economics. Maybe I'm presumptuous there, but, but I'd like to think that. So I'm less impressed, Reinhart and Rogoff. When you look at the more recent period, your N here is very small. The number of examples of countries that had financial crises that really had the freedom to run their own monetary and fiscal policy, very, very small indeed. So I'm not impressed that we have this weight of history behind us that we just can't break out of.
I know you want to move on, but
go
just
ahead,
one thing. I think this debate, maybe even among us now, but certainly in the press or otherwise, has been politicized and taken very much into either or. And I think there is a way that says, look, we still have a lot of demand-driven work to do, and that will take care of a lot of the unemployment issue. But you mentioned North Dakota. I come back to North Dakota as a fabulous example. They've got a 4.3% unemployment rate. They've got GDP. I mean, they literally have a frothy market. But even there, the long-term unemployment rate is 4 times what it ever has been. And so that says to me, I actually am supportive of more demand-side policies because I think we still have too many people who are not participating in the labor force, but I don't think that's going to get over what is becoming a very significant 2-3% of that unemployment is now this long-term unemployed, and I do think we need targeted policies to get people back in the labor force and get them reemployed, or else we're going to lose that capacity over time. So I would like to conclude that this isn't an either-or debate. I think there's a combination of responses. So lead into the response.
Before we get into the question of how to get them back in the labor force, what about the shorter term question of do we owe these people much longer unemployment compensation or not? And obviously that's been the political issue, and it's been a very divisive issue. And I suspect this group doesn't agree among itself. Who should we start with? The usual suspect?
Well, of course I'm going to say that. No, look, I mean, I'm basing this on the research on it, and maybe someone else will cite research otherwise, but, there's research by Jesse Rothstein and the San Francisco Fed and Henry Farber Princeton, all of which show pretty much the same thing. When you end benefits, it's not everyone runs out and gets jobs. They just go out of, they stop looking, So as long as you're getting benefits, you're required to at least go through the motions. I know people say they're not serious, but you have to at least say, I went to this and that employer. So you at least have to pretend to try. Once your benefits end, no requirement, and the vast majority of people, they don't suddenly go, oh, I gotta get serious and find a job. They just stop looking.
Steve, you have not been waving at me, but I have a feeling. But do you want to add to this? Because
I have a simple answer. I think Dean's given you a very good economist answer. I would give you a different kind of answer, which is just simply being humane. I think you've got people who have lost their benefits by the passage of time. I think you can go case by case, but in balance, I don't think it's their fault. I think it's the fault of, frankly, a lot of people in Washington who made some bad policies. Some of it is just the normal business cycle, whatever. And I do think actually there's a majority in Congress right now to fix this situation, but it is a prisoner of the ugly politics and policymaking process in Washington, in which it is very hard to get anything done, even something that is small and I think as sensible as this would be.
And to add to that, I agree with that 100%, but the idea that at a time when we all agree there's a demand issue, you're going to curtail demand of the people who are going to spend every bit of that unemployment insurance because that's their propensity to spend is so high, it just seems so contradictory. So it's inhumane and it's contradictory to the general thing of sustaining the economy.
I can actually.
I want to disagree.
Kevin,
Yeah, I've got two Grinches here.
Why don't you just let me go along with the gang, and then you can take us all on? I mean, I would agree with most all was saying. One thing to keep in mind is that I don't think this was mentioned is that these people that are out, it was 40% or 44% long-term unemployed of the total unemployed back in 2010. Now it's 36%, so significantly high. Their skills are atrophying. The impact on their families is even much more severe. We've talked about this in terms of income inequality. People who can't get their kids that $7,000 that most families are paying for after school things. They don't have that opportunity. They don't have a lot of opportunities. It becomes a multi-generational problem. But take it down to the economy, then you also have long-term productivity lost in the United States as well. So I think it also keeping them, even if it's marginalized, keeping them within the system. As Dean had said, getting them to say, no, you are looking for a job. You're not pushed out of the system anymore, then you are at least somewhat involved.
So now the Grinch.
Yeah, well, no, in fact, I'm not a Grinch, but I think that it's on the contrary, that we have this very outmoded unemployment insurance system that's much different from a lot of better designed systems like in Germany. Dean and I have written about it, that it's inhumane to have a system like the one we do, where if you look in the data, if someone wants to get technically into it, there's the basic idea that reemployment in the data, there are reemployment spikes sort of right near the beginning of an unemployment spell, and then when the UI benefits end. And you see the spike quite clearly if you look at the probability of reemployment divided by the number of people that are still unemployed. If you divide by the number of people who are unemployed on the first day and even out 99 weeks, then the spike is less apparent because there aren't a lot of people left unemployed, thank goodness, after 50 weeks. But I'm convinced that there's an effect there that's quite significant, that the government is basically subsidizing the creation of a long-term unemployment somewhat, maybe less so in this recession because there was so so few job offers, but that we need a better system. If there are people right now, say, that have 40 weeks left, then what I say is give them 40 weeks of cash. But if they get a job tomorrow, they get to keep the cash. That making them have to stay unemployed to continue to get. Basically, what you're doing is you're separating them from the labor force and subsidizing a longer term problem by giving them an incentive not to take reemployment. But there's a long history going back to Myron Katz of people seeing that little spike when the UI benefits end. And I think that maybe it's not such a big deal in this recovery, but the risk is just too high if you think about how serious the long-term unemployment problem is.
Can I say one thing about this? So I'm sure you're right about that, but I'm sure it's also true that any government transfer program, we saw all this publicity around the idea that Obamacare was going to cause 2 or 3 million people not to lose their jobs, but to stop working because they no longer needed that additional income or health care coverage or whatever. So obviously there's a push and pull in almost every government transfer payment as to what incentives you're creating for people. I'm not at all, just to be clear, I'm not at all opposed to any of your ideas. I'm just trying to be practical, and in the real world as we sit here today, there's a choice between extending what we have or having nothing, because there's no possibility, I don't think, that this Congress, just as a practical matter, is going to get together and agree on something sensible like what you're proposing, or I'm sure there are other ideas out there as well.
And for me, I'm very torn on that because I worry that by extending it, if that's the only choice you have, that you're going to take some people and make it really hard for them to ever reconnect.
Yeah, but you're going to take a lot more
those
people.
spikes are pretty small, Kevin.
No, they're not.
But I'd also say, well, the research, we go over this later, but the research I've seen shows them to be a very small share of the people who had been unemployed. Now, maybe the ones who stay unemployed, because a lot of people leave the workforce. Maybe it's a large share of those who stay unemployed. But if that you have that as your denominator. But the other thing I'd say, I think I'm agreeing with Steve here, that I'm open to changing the system, as we've talked about. There's lots of things we should look to do, but I guess it's kind of a leaky roof problem. We should be looking to change the system, but I don't know if I'd want to do it right now. So, in other words, these are good things to experiment with. I don't know if I want to experiment with millions of people who are facing a cutoff of their benefits.
Let's talk about the middle term, because Kevin was talking earlier before we brought here about the possibility of government subsidized a job sharing. And it is quite an intriguing idea. You only have 30 seconds. Let's see if you can push it out in 30 seconds. But I'm not sure many of you have heard about this.
Well, Dean and I began working on this together a while ago, and a law was passed, I think in part because of hard work we did with the bipartisan guys. And the basic idea is change the unemployment insurance to a fractional one, where instead of, so if you lay off a worker, you have to lay off a whole worker firm to get UI benefits. But if you cut hours 20% for 5 people, then they get nothing. And the insurance program will accept in some states and in Germany they have a system where you can cut hours and wages 20% for 5 people, and then they each get 20% of their UI benefits, and it gives firms an incentive to reduce job destruction because they get cost savings, and then if the recovery comes, then they don't have to go through costly search to replace the guys that they laid off. And right now, job creation and destruction are, about 4 million a month now. And if you could reduce job destruction by a few percentage points, then you could add to the net job creation every month a couple 100,000 people, and really go a long way towards getting this to be solved. The problem is, so Dean and I worked hard with people, Republicans in the House and Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, and they passed a law to make it so that the federal government would eat the costs for the states if they adopted these work sharing programs. And pretty much not many of them have been doing it. And Dean and I have been talking now about we have to do another legislative run. If you go back and look at the change of the drinking age, everybody changed it to 21 overnight, even Texas, for goodness sakes, where you can have a beer and a gun in the car, right? And so why did they do it? Well, they cut highway funding. I think it was only like 5% if you didn't change the drinking age. And I think that work sharing has such an opportunity to change our labor market that we need to think about some federal program, something like that gets all the states to really pursue this aggressively.
So now it'll be Kevin Hassett, welfare queen and jackboot federal.
That's the problem, is the federalism.
I don't want to spring it on you guys, but do any of the three of you have an opinion about this idea of incentives for work sharing?
I could say, I think it's actually very interesting, Kevin, what you're talking about. I'm thinking in terms of, well, actually, I was going to take it a little further into another area that's a big concern of mine, is that you're seeing a lot of students who are getting out of school and they can't get a job. So how do you? Of course, it was because the recession and recovery has been so weak, but there's also the question of, do they have the skills that are needed to make it in the business world? One of the things that seems to be an interesting way to approach is actually a school business partnership, sort of in line with what you're talking about, I guess on a different subject. But if you did actually have sort of a kind of a coordination or cooperation among businesses and schools, say community colleges, about what the businesses are looking for and how to shape that the school curricula, you may actually see students actually getting positions much more quickly. It could also be tied to apprenticeship, which I think would be another way of getting kids more ready and more able to get that job and not live on their parents' couch.
Well, you changed the subject elegantly, but since you did, I'll let this stand, and I will also go right to Deanna. Excuse me, damn it, I apologize. Because one of your babies is integration of education and work.
Yes.
Give us a brief idea of beyond the simplest idea. Yeah, we ought to be doing some of this stuff. Can you be specific about what we're not doing that we should be doing?
Sure. And let me just pick up where you started us, which is this whole issue about unemployment, long-term employment, all the things we've talked about is so critical in the youth unemployment issue. If you look in every country around the world, the youth unemployment rates are higher than they've ever been, even for college graduates, and certainly below that. So we did a very extensive review of this question of what's happening with the youth unemployment around the world. And I think the first observation, which is really important to delivering a solution space, is what we describe as sort of parallel universes of what the education world is doing, what employers are doing, and what youth and families are doing. And until we begin to see this as a system that has 3 critical interventions, which is what are the training programs, what is the education you're choosing, what kinds of choices are being made, say at the individual student family level, as requires an education, and that there's real interventions to make sure people are making good decisions, well-informed decisions about that. The second one is in the acquisition of skills themselves, even either on the job or in the transition from education to employment. And everything from on-the-job trainings, internships, anything that gives people real live experience. Because the problem we have today is that corporates will say, I don't want to hire anyone who doesn't have 3 years experience. Well, you're not going to, that's a pretty fundamental thing. So we've got to create experience that feels like something that companies will willingly ascribe to. And then the third one is making that job choice, making that decision, which includes facilitating mobility. We have the lowest mobility rate in our country than we've ever had, both sector to sector and regional. So the fact that North Dakota is booming, 13 states, by the way, are booming, doesn't really help anybody who's not willing to move there. So to get very specific, across those three sort of intersections that I just described, getting information to students and families, it is appalling in the surveys that we did, the basis on which students are making decisions of what community college to go to, what university to go to, what course of study to pursue. And there's very little information. Some countries do this very well. They provide great information for people, and the result is that they channel people toward different kinds of education. For some people, a 4-year liberal arts education is a fabulous thing. For other people, that is not the right answer given what they want to do with their lives. But we've created a stigma around vocational training, a stigma around different types of education that is really hard to break. Korea, as an example, had the exact same problem. They have worked hard to create sort of these Meister programs that allow people who aren't going to go through a traditional college career get skills that are immediately employable, and it's getting rid of the stigma allows people to participate happily in an economy the way they want to participate. There's still a very big issue around affordability, and there are a lot of people who would make the right choice, have the opportunity, but still can't get access to funding for schools. And the administration's actually done quite a bit to try and improve that, but it's still an issue. And the cost of education does not help. So addressing that. And then there's a really big problem with dropouts. If you look at people who start programs of all sorts, whether they're training programs, vocational programs, community colleges, or full 4-year university degrees. And there are programs like the University of Miami-Dade that have really targeted dropout rates very successfully. And if people complete, they're more likely to end up employed. In terms of building the right skills, I mentioned, getting more standardized curriculums. This is very controversial in our country, but the more we have a basic common core of educational skills, the more deployable those skills are going to be, the more mobility is possible, and that's a good thing.
Let me interrupt you. As you've been talking about this, I've been asking myself, well, this all sounds like common sense, sort of. I mean,
common sense, but it's not being done.
But it's not being done, and the question is why. Is this about lack of trust in government? Because all this stuff takes some level of trust in government and some common sense at the government level, doesn't it?
Yes and no. Not everything I said, and I could keep going. You asked for specifics. I could keep going on specifics, is necessarily a government role. I mean, I think what we would say is already there's some good entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs that are starting to get more information out there. There's a huge role for social entrepreneurs. There's a very large role for corporations, for businesses, large, small, and otherwise, to more actively participate in what's going on in their schools by bringing kids in for a day of exposure to what people do in their companies, et cetera. And there is, at least in my view, a role for an integrator. And some people would favor that being a government agency of some sort. Others would favor it being some kind of public-private partnership. Others would say, forget either of those, make it a purely private thing. I think all kinds of models we've seen working around the world, but the idea that these three universes of educators, youth, and their families, and employers are just going to go on their merry ways without those bridges being created, I think is leaving a lot on the table.
I hate to do this, but there's a little more material I'd like to cover. And one of them, I think, is something that Beth Ann wanted to talk about, which is how immigration or immigration reform fits into this whole issue of high chronic unemployment, and both the political and economics, the politics and economics of it.
Sure. I did want to talk to Deanna's point, but I'll stop there and move to first. I would go to chart 9. which is on the, should be on there. There you're looking at the underutilization indicator, which is not on there. Imagine this is looking at the labor participation rate, which is at a 35-year low. When people aren't working, that means two things. Well, it means a lot of things. It's kind of depressing, but it also means two things in particular. One, if they're not working, they're not producing for the economy. The economy is not growing. So less productivity and the long-term risk. Another is if they're not working, that means Uncle Sam's not getting any taxes on them. So that's a big issue. Now, to Deanna's point, that's just looking at the total. To Deanna's point, if you look at the people between the ages of 20 and 24, it had reached, it's a little down by now, but it had reached a 4-decade low. Now, a lot of them probably went back to school. The question is, are they going to get a job this time around? We'll see. But a lot of them also were tied into businesses that basically either construction or other things where they didn't actually get back to work, and maybe one of those long-term unemployed questions. I'll go to, before I do want to talk about another thing, but I'll stop and focus on what Peter said, as I'll talk about immigration policy. What we said, I did some research on there, and one of the things I noted. Now, if you go to the next chart, which was chart 10, which people had talked about. Now, the question of whether it's a completely skills gap, or there are other factors going on, I think there's a mix. There's probably a bit of both. But I think this chart, to give you an idea of what this means, this is called the Beveridge curve. And usually, what you would see, that low sloping line, what you normally see is that of course, in times when the unemployment rate is very, very low, well, you'd expect to see businesses having a hard time filling the vacancy rates. So that non-farm vacancy rates, well, they have a hard time filling them. So you'd expect it to go up. But of course, as the unemployment rate gets higher and higher, well, probably not a lot of job vacancy rates out there. So businesses aren't really hiring. So you expect that to come down. But what we have seen seems to be a shift out of what's the so-called Beveridge curve. Now, to give you an idea what that means is that what you're looking at right now, we're at about 2.8% for job vacancy rates. Typically, that would equate to about an unemployment rate at about 5%. In this time around, in both during the recession and this recovery, that 2.8% number that we've been at has been hovering. The unemployment rate's been hovering around 6.7% and 8%. It hasn't really come down yet. Now, again, I won't go into the mix-max question. It's certainly one of those that's out there. But what can immigration policy have an impact on? So one of the things that I have been looking at is immigration reform, immigration policy that focuses on, in particular, employment-based policy, employment-based immigration, focusing on high-skilled immigrants. I believe that would help fill the gap. What we've seen in my analysis, it showed that if you did see kind of an inflow of basically young, skilled labor into the economy, you would see likely over the next 10 years, starting in 2015, which I started at, to 2024, you're looking at adding about 3.2% growth to the real economy. That's over those 10 years.
Just so people are clear, what you're arguing is unintuitively that letting more skilled workers in would actually increase the demand for labor more than it would reduce the demand for domestic labor.
The economy gets bigger. There's a lot of ways you look at it. One, of course, adding more people to the economy, well, they all buy stuff too. So if they're buying stuff, then that means somebody's selling it. So that would suggest, just on the question of more bodies to the economy, means that you're going to have more demand. But let's take it to high-skilled immigrant workers, which is sort of what I was focusing on. What you've noticed is, indeed, high-skilled immigrants. Well, what we saw that actually is something that would actually create jobs. You have seen it in terms of high-skilled immigrants, increase in innovation and also productivity. You've also seen it in terms of innovation and productivity. Immigrants, analysis has shown that immigrants have contributed to 75% of all the patents that were made at the top 100 universities. And foreign nationals have contributed to about 25% of all the U.S. international patents applicants, and this was in 2006. I don't have any further data going out, but you can get the sense that immigrants are certainly very innovative and those patents are indeed improving our productivity across the U.S. We've also found that immigrants, and this would be based on a few numbers. I think the Kaiser Foundation was one that spearheaded it. Immigrants are also more likely to create new businesses than than US-born Americans. You've started to see, and since startups are certainly a big engine of job creation, that would be good for the US as well. The AEI, the American Institute study came out, American Enterprise Institute study came out, I think it was in 2012. But what they looked at and what they came across was that for each additional, this would take into account innovation, productivity, and of course the job creation. For each additional 100 foreigners with advanced degrees, that was associated with 44 additional American jobs. And if those immigrants with advanced degrees were particularly in the STEMs field, that would be science, engineering, mathematics, and technology, in that field, that's associated with adding about 262 additional American jobs. So I see it as a creative factor.
Does anybody want, I mean, this in a way is a slightly controversial idea. Does anybody on the panel want to push back at all?
Yeah, I'll push back a little bit.
Okay, you push back, and then we're going to go on to what I consider deserving.
But I just want to say that the numbers just cited, this is only going to take 30 seconds,
okay,
that it's very hard analysis in the sense that we know where the H-1Bs live, and you can look at the sort of geographic region where there's a spike in H-1Bs and see what happens to employment. And those numbers are pretty convincing to me, that if you hire an H-1B person, then you create, if it's a STEM person, about 2 jobs
okay,
in addition to that.
I really want to make 2 more points.
Real quick.
Okay, 2 more points. Go to chart 11. One of the reasons why we would like to see more young workers coming into the U.S. The census says by 2030, of the U.S. residents in the United States, 20% will be of people of the ages 65 and older. If we do introduce immigration policy with a much more employment-based focus, what you would see there of those people that were brought in, only about 6% would be of people of the age of 65 and older. So I'll stop there and give it back to Dean.
Okay, Dean gets the last word on this subject, and then I want to move on to a blue sky subject to end with.
I wasn't going to deal with that one, but since you mentioned it, we've actually had a larger increase in the percentage of the population over 65 between, let's say, 1960 and the present than we're going to see in the next 30 years. So that, I think, we should have better reasons to bring in immigrants than that. I'd say if we want to bring in immigrants, I'd start with doctors. We pay more than twice as much on average for our doctors as for other wealthy countries. If we paid the same as they did in Germany, Japan, pick your country, we'd save on the order of $100 billion a year. That's what I'd really like to see. In the case of, I'll just be agnostic on bringing in more high-skilled immigrants. I'll just point out the wages of domestic high-skilled immigrants have not been rising. I mean, high STEM workers have not really been rising much over the last decade. So again, we don't seem to have businesses acting as though there's a shortage of labor. They're supposed to be raising wages. And just a very quick anecdote in this, there was a great story in the Times. Thomas Friedman had a column about 4 months ago where he's saying, I was in Chicago and I talked to these manufacturers and they said, I'd hire any worker with the right skills who came through the door, but these workers need to know metallurgy, they need to know computers, they need to know advanced math. And anyhow, what was great was Adam Davidson, who also writes for the Times and has NPR's Planet Money, he followed up, he got the names of these people and he asked, what do you pay? And they were saying, 14, 15 bucks an hour. Well, you can't expect someone to have a lot of sophisticated skills if you're paying $14, $15 an hour. So if that person tells me there's a skills shortage, I'd say yes. The people doing the hiring don't know what they're doing.
We're bouncing around, but it's the nature of the subject. I want to bring up one last subject, and if the panel keeps going on it, that's fine. If you guys run out of gas quickly, we'll have some time for questions. And that's the issue of automation. Some of you are old enough to remember when automation was the thing that was going to destroy America. There would be no jobs left. And then it all went away, and the great American jobs machine was at work, and this is the country of, that machines produce more jobs than they destroy. It has a parallel to what you were saying about skilled workers, in a way. And we kind of all forgot about it, at least those of us who wanted to forget about it. But maybe it's changing now. This is what I want to raise with you guys. Maybe it's changing. Maybe robotics is accelerating at a rate now which we did not see before, that we are at a kind of inflection point in which things could go south very rapidly. I refer to you, I don't know how many of you went to the panel yesterday on autonomous vehicles. It seems to me what they were saying is in 10 or 15 years, every truck in the United States could be driven by a machine. We don't need truck drivers anymore. We won't need truck drivers anymore. Now, if this is a world that's plausible, what are we going to do about it? I mean, and now maybe you all want to say to me, it's not plausible. Let's go on to the questions from the audience. But if any of you want to address this, I'd like to hear it.
So I'll say a couple things about it, because I've actually been thinking about this and I'm going to write something about it. So it is not just the last, say, 30 or 40 years or whatever your time frame you're putting around automation being a worry. They're obviously with the Luddites, but I happen to have with me, and not for this panel, but for something else. In 1589, Queen Elizabeth I refused to patent a knitting machine for fear it would put my poor subjects out of work. So the question of automation and technology has been with us. Probably if you went back to the invention of the wheel, people were worrying that this was going to put people who carried things out of work.
Dean gets mad if you use thousands of years.
Oh, yes,
history,
right. Yeah, thousands of years. Look, some of us here are old enough to remember the days when there were like telephone operators. When was the last time anybody here spoke to a telephone operator? When was the last time someone, those of us who sort of do written things, gave something we wrote to someone to type for us, like what used to be called a secretary? You can go through 1,000 examples. The famous example, of course, about the farmers and what percent of the country, Mike showed some slides about this, Mike Milken, about this yesterday. What percent of the country today are farmers versus 100 years ago? I mean, the whole nature of our economic improvement and progress over the years is a function of productivity improvement, which is in turn a function of technology, which you can in turn call automation. And in fact, to your point, in the course of this thing that I'm going to write, I found a Life magazine cover from 1963, which had this big headline that says, "Point of no return for everybody. Automation's really here, jobs go scarce." This was right before the greatest job boom in our history, well, one of them anyway, in the 60s. And so it's fundamental to our progress to have, whether you want to call it automation, whether you want to call it technology, whatever you want to call it, we have to have it in order for us to progress successfully. There's no evidence at the moment in the data that this time will be different. It could be, but if you look at productivity statistics, which is where you would see it reflected if suddenly people weren't doing as much stuff, productivity has actually been rather slow the last few years, not speeding up in any respect. So you have to hypothesize that this time will be different. Even though we don't see it in the data, it's somehow going to be different. And even if you knew it was going to be different, what's the right response to that? The right response to that is not to push back against the automation, in my view. The right response to that is what we've done inadvertently, or without forethought in the last 500 years, which is to find other things for these workers to do where they can produce stuff. And that would be the way you'd respond to it if you really thought there was some new huge wave of driverless cars upon us.
Can I jump in too?
Please do.
Yeah, in fact, I think that you might argue, certainly the robot thing is something to think about, but I think that a near-term jobs issue that we haven't talked about that is one of the causes for hope is, think about who right now in the U.S. has the best boss. I would argue that it's the Uber driver. Right, so if you know the app Uber, if you buy a car, then you never see your boss. It's just your iPhone tells you there's a passenger waiting for you on the street corner, and you go pick them up. And I have noticed, because I use Uber a lot, I love this app, but there are a lot of other apps like that in other places in the workforce. But when you talk to the Uber drivers, they're really satisfied workers. They get to work when they want. They don't work when they don't want. There's one fellow who gave me a ride in Chicago who said that he does 3 drives from O'Hare a day. He lives next to O'Hare, and he gets about $60 a trip. And it's really changed his life, but he has a lot of freedom, and he's getting an income. My view is that this kind of micro job reduces the barrier to entry. So if it's an opportunity for long-term unemployed people to maybe long-term unemployed people, it's easier for them to become Uber drivers. But I think that we're going to see an explosion of that because of information technology. I've looked, and there are people that get babysitters that way, and baseball coaches, and sort of every kind of service that needs to be matched.
As an economist, let me rephrase this, because I don't think any of us are going to give this justice to this. Essentially, what you're saying is that the technological bias toward machines is never going to be strong enough to eliminate the opportunities associated with the demand for new kinds of products, for new kinds of services, or at least be offset by the fact there are much lower transactions costs in getting people connected to work. Is that really necessary?
You still have to have the research behind it. I mean, when you're talking about, it would be great. I mean, it's fantastic. We all have a cell phone, and who would have thought that was the case? But I would say that you also have the research. This would actually free up research, free up the thought, the mind, to be able to look for other things, to be productive for other things. We still haven't solved cancer. We still haven't solved so many other things. And that would also then feed into another generation of careers and jobs.
I think that's right. And I think if you go back 20 years and you say, what jobs do you think will be in existence in 2014? Half the job categories people wouldn't have known what they were, and I think that was happening. But I do think there is something about the speed with which technology is entering our lives, or otherwise, that gets shown up in the percentage of temp workers has gone up dramatically, 46% increase in temp workers. Steve, you mentioned a shift towards different kinds of jobs, et cetera. But there's a level of instability in the job market that is very catastrophic for people who really rely on that paycheck week to week. And it may be that if we're going to embrace, as I think we must, embrace a lot of these technological changes, we have to embrace thinking about jobs differently than we have done in the past, which means jobs were a bundle of the activities you did over the course of the day, your health care, your unemployment mechanism, backup, et cetera. And I think part of what you're seeing, correctly I believe, in the expansion of health care coverage and the expansion of other things is a recognition that jobs are going to do less of that for people. And we need other mechanisms to do that so that we can more easily embrace that kind of technological evolution.
Dean, are you going to come to my aid at all?
Well, a couple quick points. One is that we can deal with this by shortening work hours, which is something we work about 25% more hours than people do in Europe, which I think is a good thing. Paid time off, paid family leave, paid vacations, whatever. The other point, and I just find this kind of mind-boggling, that at the same time there's many people running around saying, oh my God, there's not going to be any work for us because of the robots, computers replacing us. We have a lot of the most prominent people in economics on productivity, Robert Gordon in particular, who I think most of us are familiar with, who, we don't have to agree with him, but he's certainly a serious person. He's going, oh no, productivity growth coming to an end. We're going to look at forevermore very slow productivity growth. Now, I think he's wrong, but it's kind of striking that you do have certainly a very intelligent, thoughtful person who's like 180 degrees at odds with this concern. We're going to have too little productivity growth, not too much.
Well, unless somebody else has something more to say on this, I want to make one comment on myself. This is the first time I've ever moderated a panel where I'm the Chicken Little. But anybody have any more comments? Or
You're the Chicken Little about what? About automation? Or?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say before that, there are a lot of people not on this panel maybe who don't agree with us, and or some of us anyway, and who do believe automation, that this time will be different, and that automation is going to have a lot of people sitting around with nothing to do. There are a lot of people who believe that. I'm not one of them, and I don't
Is that
think
going to be Terminator 4 too?
Well, it brings up the subject of whether or not we should start thinking about supporting people and not necessarily connecting it to work always, as in the universal basic income, which is another subject for another place and another time. And with that, I think we've run out of time, and I want to thank our panel.
Thank you all.
Thank you.